In April 1945, the Third Reich no longer truly existed as a functioning state. It continued to fight, but only in form, not in reality. The front lines were closing in on Berlin from all directions. The city, once presented as the symbol of power and order, had turned into a landscape of ruins. The front lines were closing in on Berlin from all directions. The city, once presented as the symbol of power and order, had turned into a landscape of ruins. Artillery fire echoed day and night. Buildings collapsed into dust. The streets were filled with wounded soldiers, civilians, and fragments of shattered divisions. And beneath all of this, deep underground, another world existed. A hidden one. 8 meters below the surface, under the Reich Chancellery, stood the Führerbunker, a sealed concrete labyrinth where Adolf Hitler would spend the final days of his life. The exact circumstances of his death would remain debated for decades. According to Hans Rottenhuber, the head of Hitler's security, a gunshot was heard. Moments later, he entered the room. He saw Hitler sitting on a sofa. His head was slumped forward. His face was covered in blood. Next to him sat Eva Braun. There were no visible injuries. Near her body lay a small metal capsule. It resembled a lipstick container. It was poison. Different narratives emerged almost immediately. Soviet accounts insisted that Hitler had died by poison. Western historians argued that he had shot himself and that the poison narrative was meant to humiliate him, even in death. But beyond the details, one fact remains clear. The end came in isolation, in fear, and in complete collapse. Weeks earlier, Hitler had been urged to leave Berlin. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and General Alfred Jodl strongly advised evacuation. They proposed relocating to the Bavarian Alps, to Obersalzberg. There, a fortified defensive zone had been prepared, an so-called Alpine fortress. It included underground facilities, supply networks, and strong anti-aircraft defenses. A last possible refuge. From a military perspective, the move made sense, but Hitler refused. In the final days inside the bunker, time itself seemed to lose its meaning. The outside world was collapsing by the hour, yet underground, routines still existed. Meals were served, meetings were held, reports were delivered. But these rituals had become hollow. Officers continued to move pieces on maps that no longer reflected reality. Entire divisions that had already been destroyed were still being discussed as if they could be deployed. Orders were issued to units that no longer existed. And yet, no one openly challenged this illusion. The atmosphere inside the bunker was tense but strangely controlled. Voices were kept low. Movements were careful. Everyone understood that the end was near, but few dared to speak of it directly. Some still clung to hope. Others were already thinking about survival. A few simply waited. Food supplies were limited but not yet exhausted. Simple meals were prepared in the kitchen, often consisting of canned goods and basic rations. Hitler himself ate very little. His diet remained strictly vegetarian. Even in the final days, he insisted on routine. Electric lighting replaced any sense of day or night. Without sunlight, people began to lose track of time. Sleep cycles broke down. Fatigue became constant. The bunker was not only physically isolated, it was psychologically detached from reality. Occasionally, the sound of explosions above would shake the walls. Dust would fall from the ceiling. Each Udar reminded those inside that the world above them was disappearing. Some members of the staff later recalled that what disturbed them most was not fear, but the silence between events. The waiting. The sense that everything had already ended, but had not yet officially stopped. By the final days, it had become clear to everyone inside the bunker that there would be no rescue, no counterattack, no miracle. Only an ending that was approaching, minute by minute. For him, leaving Berlin was unthinkable. It was not only a strategic decision, it was symbolic. If the Reich was to fall, he would fall with it. The bunker itself was a highly engineered structure. It had its own power supply, water reserves, air filtration systems designed to protect against chemical attacks. Inside were offices, sleeping quarters, communication rooms, and medical areas. At the center were Hitler's private rooms. On one wall hung a portrait of Frederick the Great, a ruler Hitler deeply admired. Perhaps he saw in that image a reflection of what he once believed himself to be. But by April 1945, that image no longer matched reality. Physically, Hitler was deteriorating. Witnesses described constant trembling in his hands. His posture had changed. He dragged one leg when he walked. His face had become pale and hollow, his voice weaker. He was exhausted. For years, he had relied heavily on medication. His personal physician, Theodor Morell, administered a wide range of substances. Among them was Pervitin, a form of methamphetamine widely used in Nazi Germany. These drugs had long-term effects. They amplified instability. They weakened both body and mind. Eventually, even Morell lost Hitler's trust. Paranoia intensified. Hitler became convinced that doctors might sedate him with morphine, that they would force him out of Berlin against his will. He dismissed them. From that point on, he remained largely untreated. His fears extended even further. He believed Soviet forces might use gas to capture him alive. There was no evidence for this, but inside the bunker, logic was no longer the guiding force. Fear was. And yet, amid this collapse, a strange detail stands out. Hitler developed an increasing craving for sweets, chocolate, cakes, small comforts in a world that was rapidly disintegrating. Despite everything, some in the Nazi leadership still searched for a way out. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, continued to look for solutions. He studied past events. He tried to understand how the Soviet Union had defended Moscow in 1941. He hoped there was still a strategy hidden somewhere in history. Both Goebbels and Hitler believed in one last possibility: a split among the Allies. They assumed tensions between the Soviet Union and the Western powers could be exploited. They believed Stalin might agree to separate negotiations. But this hope had no foundation. The Soviet leadership rejected any contact. The war would end only with total surrender. Inside the regime, collapse accelerated. Hermann Göring attempted to assume leadership. He cited a legal decree that named him successor. Hitler interpreted this as betrayal. Göring was stripped of power and placed under arrest. At the same time, Heinrich Himmler was secretly negotiating with Western intermediaries through Sweden. He sought a separate peace. This was not strategy anymore. It was survival. Even within Hitler's closest circle, panic spread. Hermann Fegelein, connected to Eva Braun's family, attempted to flee Berlin. He was captured. On Hitler's direct order, he was executed in the garden of the Chancellery. No trial, no hesitation. Amid this collapse, Hitler made a final personal decision. He chose to marry Eva Braun. She had waited for years, always in the background, never publicly acknowledged. Now, in the final hours, she became his wife. The ceremony took place inside the bunker. It was brief, quiet. There was no celebration. Witnesses included Goebbels and Martin Bormann. The following day, Hitler dictated his political testament. He appointed Karl Donitz as president, Joseph Goebbels as chancellor. On paper, the government continued. In reality, it was already gone. Before his death, Hitler took one final precaution. He tested the poison. On his dog, Blondie. The animal died. The result confirmed the method. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler said his final goodbyes. Those present described the moment as formal and restrained. There was no visible emotion. Then he withdrew into his private room with Eva Braun. Minutes passed. Then, a gunshot. The instructions had already been given. The bodies were carried outside into the garden of the Reich Chancellery. They were placed in a shell crater. Fuel had been prepared in advance, around 200 liters of gasoline. The bodies were set on fire. Hitler had been determined about one thing. He did not want to be captured. He did not want to be displayed. The fate of Benito Mussolini, whose body had been publicly exhibited, had left a deep impression on him. The burning continued for several hours. What remained was barely recognizable. But the tragedy did not end there. Joseph Goebbels refused to continue in power. He and his wife Magda chose to follow Hitler in death. Before doing so, Magda made a decision that would become one of the darkest acts of the war. She poisoned all 6 of their children. She believed they had no future in a world without National Socialism. After the war, Soviet specialists examined the remains believed to belong to Hitler. Identification was carried out using dental records, teeth, jaw fragments, prosthetics. The evidence pointed to one conclusion. Yet even then, the truth was not fully revealed. Joseph Stalin encouraged uncertainty. Rumors spread that Hitler had escaped, that he had fled to Spain or South America. The remains were buried, moved, and reburied several times. Finally, in 1970, they were exhumed once again. They were burned, and the ashes were scattered into a river. With Hitler's death, the Third Reich collapsed completely, not only politically, but ideologically. A system that had appeared unshakable disintegrated within days. Those who had sworn loyalty until the end quickly adapted. Many began cooperating with occupying forces. It became clear that the structure had been built around a single figure. Without him, it could not survive. The final days of the Third Reich were not a dramatic last stand. They were something else. A slow unraveling, a collapse from within. And in the end, what remained was not power, not legacy, but a warning of how fragile even the most rigid systems can be when they lose their connection to reality.